Good evening, ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties. This is Alex coming at you from the underworld, and welcome back to another episode of... I'm gonna go on and use the opportunity to start my Halloween lineup.
Did you say Halloween?
You!
Mm-hmm.
Carrie, I am in no mood to put up with your jackassery this year. Over the last few years, you have assaulted me with pumpkin spice lattes. You have made me look like a damn fool in makeup. You have put explicitly carved jack-o'-lanterns on this channel. And all of last year, you and that snake Connie decided to put curses on me. What do you have up your filthy little sleeve this year?
I'm learning tarot, and I pulled this card that represents you.
Give that to me. The Fool? What in the hell is that? Son of a bitch! Well, since the ambulance has taken Carrie away and I've had the chance to clean up, as I was trying to say, to celebrate the upcoming season, I would like to use this opportunity to kickstart my Halloween-themed book review lineup, which first on the list is the Mountie Noir cult classic Headhunter by Michael Slade. Now, before I get started, I would just like to note that even though the primary focus of this book isn't Halloween, a good portion of it does take place in October, November, and December. So if you're a mood reader who likes to sync up your entertainment with a specific time of year, now would be the perfect opportunity to cuddle up with this book that's both a bloody good slasher and a solid whodunit. Also, I would like to add that during my childhood, I had never encountered Headhunter in our local used bookstore, but I did come across its sequel, Ghoul. And despite Ghoul having this really awesome, gruesome cover, for some reason I never gave Michael Slade a try. Well, decades later, after I fell in love with Grady Hendrix's Paperbacks from Hell, I started to collect vintage horror paperbacks. And this is when I started to collect the Michael Slade books, which are known as the Special X series. Even still, I really didn't give these books a try until my good online friend Hanny contacted me and said that I had to read Headhunter because it was the most gruesome book she had ever read. Then, after I agreed to read this with her, even though she had read it before, she gifted me a hardback edition, which I absolutely love, and at the same time, one of my good online friends, Rooftop Chris, had gifted me the paperback edition, which, of course, I'm going to hang on to both because they have two completely different covers, and I'm just a hoarder like that. But I would just like to say to both Hanny and Chris, thank you so very much for these gifts. But with that said, I would like to thank Hanny for recommending this book and buddy reading it with me. And even though she had read Headhunter years ago, it was still fun to read it with her because as she teased me about already knowing who the killer was, it made me want to solve this case even that much more. But anywho, without me rambling on any further, let's join Robert DeClercq and his Headhunter squad as they comb the cold streets of Victoria for a maniac who is beheading women with long black hair. Headhunter by Michael Slade primarily takes place in the 1980s. However, to build character development for the antagonist known as Sparky, there are chapters seasoned throughout that give insight into Sparky's lineage. And this is to show how a long line of abuse, dysfunction, and mental illness has created the perfect storm for a homicidal maniac. With that said, this book opens up in the cold Canadian wilderness during 1897, and it introduces a ruthless bounty hunter named William Blake who has encountered quite a few beheadings throughout his life, which this is due to the time that he served with the British Imperial Army. Then, after we receive a taste of what Blake has experienced and what he's capable of, the book fast forwards to 1982, where the decapitated bodies of black haired women who had been sexually assaulted are being investigated. Well, as the body count rises, with their remains found in gruesome and creative ways, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police form a group called the Headhunter Squad, which it's during this time that their commissioner has reached out to the iconic Robert de Klerk to come out of retirement where he can help them solve these crimes. From here, we're presented with a suspect list that stretches all the way from the streets of Canada to the New Orleans bayous. And eventually, the reader is provided with a jaw dropping twist that will leave them in disbelief. Headhunter by Michael Slade was published in 1984, and it became the first book in a 14-novel series known as the Special X series. Upon its release, Alice Cooper praised the novel by saying that Headhunter stunned him. Also, Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho, praised the book as a real thriller and the most gruesome thing he had ever read. Decades later, this cult classic received an updated version called Headhunter Reimagined. Following its ebook release in 2017, Cemetery Dance published a print edition. On Slade's website, the author explains inspiration for Headhunter began during his childhood when he encountered a horror story about the French Revolution where thousands of people were guillotined. With that exposure, he discovered that a severed human head can survive for up to a minute on the blood oxygen supply in his brain. Yet more jolting than that story, when Slade was 8, he was traumatized after seeing the gory cover for an issue of Male magazine which regarded headhunters. It was also during his adolescence when he was attacked by a rabid neighborhood dog named Sparky. Upon co-writing Headhunter, he decided Sparky would be a good alias for the serial killer. Other inspirations for Headhunter came about during Slade's career as a criminal lawyer, where he had defended sex workers of all genders. And during that time, because of his success, he gained the nickname the Hooker's Lawyer. From 1972 on, Slade defended and sometimes prosecuted over 1,000 trials involving homicide and insanity cases, one of which included a murder that occurred in a local rooming house full of people who suffered from drug and alcohol abuse. It was here that 2 of the male residents had fallen in love with the same woman. One evening, she answered a knock at her door to find one of her suitors beheaded the other as a romantic gesture. Upon writing Headhunter, the bounty hunter known as William Blake was inspired by Sir William Francis Butler, who fought as a Victorian soldier in India, Canada, Africa, and Egypt. Fun facts! Here's a few things you might not know about Michael Slade. In 1981, a recession caused the government to cut legal aid. It was during this time Jay Clark, Richard Cavell, and John Banks, who were 3 Vancouver lawyers that specialized in criminal insanity, came together to create the pseudonym of Michael Slade. Following the release of Headhunter, Slade continued forward with the second novel in their Special X series called Ghoul. Yet, as their journey continued, Clark's wife, Lee, would replace Richard Covell. Following Ghoul, only Jay Clark and John Banks would continue their series with Cutthroat. In 2001, Jay Clark would make his daughter, Rebecca Clark, his only co-author. Upon pursuing this journey, these authors would accrue a fan base known as Sladist, which is a play on the word sadist. Now that we have that covered, it's time to move on to the spoiler segment, which, if you haven't read this book before, I'm about to reveal some things that could ruin the experience for you. So if you would like to click away, all you have to do is scroll down to the comments, and you'll see that I have a pinned comment at the top with the timestamp in it. Once you click that timestamp, it'll direct you away from the spoilers and bring you to the thoughts section. Now, you only have 17 seconds to do this, so ready, set, go! Since everyone's had the opportunity to click away, I would like to talk about a few of my favorite moments. First up is the scene when William Blake loses his mind. Now, prior to this, Blake had brutalized and murdered a young Cree warrior named Ironchild, who he had been tracking because Ironchild had killed a sergeant after the white man had stolen his people's land. Aside from that, around this time, Blake was having these god-awful nightmares about a decapitated body that was nailed to the ceiling, and while he was awake, he would hear thumps and drips inside of his head. Well, on this one fateful day, when the sounds become so insufferable, Blake decides to take refuge in an empty fort that had been used by white men and indigenous persons to trade items. Then, after he locks himself inside, not only does the pounding in his head get worse, but he starts to notice a series of heavy thuds outside of his front door. So, after mustering up the courage, he throws open the front door and is met by a delusion where he sees a group of indigenous persons scalping white men. Meanwhile, as this is going down, he notices a medicine man who's crying blood. Then he sees where everyone starts to rot before his eyes. However, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because once he secures himself inside, he lights a match and sees the room is full of skeletons and gore, and just like in his nightmare, there is a decapitated body that's been nailed to the ceiling. But it's at this moment that he realizes the decapitated body is actually wearing his exact same clothes. From here, all of the skeletons come to life and chase him into the attic, where he sees an Ashanti warrior who is beating a buffalo bone against a severed head. And after he really takes a good look, he sees that the head that's being used as a drum is actually his own head. Y'all, this moment took me by complete surprise, because even though I knew Blake had a mental illness, I had no idea this book was going to go this far into left field. Like, when I encounter a slasher, I know that we're going to have moments where people get hacked up and stabbed and all of that good stuff. However, I don't expect to see skeletons and rotting people running around. So, because of this being just so completely unexpected, of course, I could not tear myself away from the book as this was playing out, and I was really happy to see Blake go through this shit because he was really an awful human being. Aside from having my bloodthirst quenched, this moment really teased me. And the main reason why is because I had no idea how to connect this history with 1982. But because of how well written and constructed this was, I knew this was a lot more than just gory fluff. So, with me suspecting that the author had something more up his sleeve, I was left questioning if this Blake dude was a historical figure that Sparky admired, or if Blake was actually related to Sparky, and we were seeing how his mental illness had been passed down. Then, when the bomb dropped and it was revealed that Blake was actually related to Sparky, it took everything within my power not to jump up and start screaming, "I knew it, I knew it, I knew it." And if I was at home, I totally would have just gone with the flow and done this, but when this reveal happened, I was actually in a hospital waiting room, so I could see where that kind of behavior would be frowned upon. My next favorite moment was the reveal of Joanna'S remains. which at this point, 2 decapitated bodies had been found. The newspaper had dubbed Sparky as the Headhunter, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had formed the group called the Headhunter Squad, which was led by Robert de Klerk. So, as all of this has come together, we are briefly introduced to a nurse named Joanna, whose maternity ward shift finished at midnight. And as she's walking home, she takes all of the precautions necessary because she knows there is a killer at large. However, when a friendly face pulls up next to her in a car, she does let her guard down. At this point, the focus shifts to a couple named Chris and Val, who are parked nearby the Museum of Anthropology. And after they have a brief argument, Val decides that despite there's a killer at large, she would much rather take her chances on the street than sit in the car with Chris for another minute. Well, after some time passes, Chris figures he needs to try to find Val before something happens to her. From there, as he's searching around, he hears a scream in the distance. Then, when he goes to see what's going on, he discovers that this is because Val has encountered the dead body of Joanna that has been nailed to a cross piece between 2 totem poles. And to make the scene even more grotesque, Joanna's dead body has been beheaded and the stump of her neck has been positioned under a piece of the structure that displays a dog's head. Prior to this, I really didn't feel shocked over the dead bodies that had been found. I mean, yeah, they were disturbing, but they weren't really shocking. And because of how far out there in left field Blake's delusion had been a few chapters prior, I kept wondering when we would be met with a crime scene that would make my eyes bulge. Well, of course, this was the scene that did it for me, and it was because of how creative the kill was. And after I had finished reading this, I had to pause for a moment just so I could digest the gory detail of what I had read. Also, I really enjoyed how this sequence was constructed because it kept me in suspense. And I think the main reasons why this setup works so well is because of its pacing and that hard cut that we received between the time when Joanna was abducted and when her dead body was found. Which, because of how this was all done, it honestly kept me turning pages to find out what happened to Joanna in that small window of time that the author didn't show us. My final favorite moment was the grand reveal. Now, leading up to this, 2 constables by the names of Span and Scarlett, who were with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, kill a guy named John in self-defense after they find evidence that he's the headhunter. And because of them doing such a good job, this elevates them to corporal status. However, even though everyone believes that the case is closed, 2 constables by the names of Mad Dog Grabowski and Al Flood believe that John was framed. So after digging around, Flood finds Sparky's actual hideout and a stash of severed heads, which he intends to take these severed heads to Robert de Klerk to prove that the maniac is still at large and John was innocent. Well, after Flood goes to de Klerk's house, his wife Genevieve explains that he's at the Red Surge Ball. Meanwhile, Sparky discovers that the severed heads are missing, which causes Sparky to have this huge Norman Bates type of breakdown. And this is when we find out that Sparky's mother is actually the dominatrix from New Orleans named Susanna that we had been earlier introduced to. Also, we find out that William Blake is really Sparky's grandfather. From here, Flood and Genevieve drive to the Red Flood Ball to speak with Robert, but once they park in the parking garage, they find where Sparky is trying to frame someone else. Then, as a shootout commences between Flood and Sparky, Flood gets shot in the lung and Genevieve gets shot in the head. From here, Sparky sets fire to the parking garage and chases Flood into an empty theater. And while Flood's hiding in the darkness, Sparky imagines these talking props in a horrific scene of cannibalism. Then, after the police arrive, Flood overhears Sparky say "Mommy," which this is enough for Flood to locate Sparky in the darkness so he can open fire. And suddenly, we're brought to Christmas Day, where DeClerc goes to the hospital to visit Sparky. Which, it's at this moment that the author uses his very last sentence to reveal that Span is actually Sparky. Y'all, when Span and Scarlet found John's hideout, I said to myself, this is just way too easy. And because of the book having a lot more left to it, I knew damn well this was not the grand finale that we were anticipating. So because of that obvious red flag, I knew that John was either being framed or he had an accomplice. Then, once I found out that Span was actually Sparky, I felt like I had had the shit shocked out of me because I honestly thought that the headhunter was a man. Which, after gaining this information, I was like, what in the hell did I miss here? So I went back and reread all of the Sparky perspectives, and it was at this moment that I realized I had just read this entire friggin' book assuming that Sparky was a man when the author never identified a gender to begin with. I would like to take this opportunity to bitch about Sparky's twisted ass family tree. And first up is that worthless shit for brains William Blake. Now, I may not have known who the killer was in this book, but I'm fairly certain that Blake had suffered from a severe case of micropenis. And because of this, he tortured the hell out of people who had a bounty on him. Which, because of him getting the job done, authorities didn't give a damn what he was doing, which, in my opinion, made them just as guilty as this sick bastard. And to be honest, I could see someone out there ask, well, what's the harm if Blake decides to rough up or torture some of the people he's been hunting? Well, for starters, there's no need in causing someone to suffer just to satisfy a sadist who's looking to get off over someone else's misery. And I understand that this is back in the day when wanted posters advertised dead or alive, but there's no need in torturing the hell out of someone before you send them off to meet their maker or send them to the slammer. Also, if this is what Blake does for fun, what in the hell does he do when he gets pissed off? Anywho, with Grand Bastard Blake aside, he passes down his toxic assholism to his two-faced crotch goblin who grows up to be a constable and Sparky's father. And even though he appears to be all honorable and shit because of his uniform, he abuses the hell out of his wife Susanna. Which, as you can imagine, Susanna gets sick of his shit and poisons his sorry ass. Now, even though I do feel sorry for Susanna because not only did she survive all of her husband's bullshit, but she also survived her perverted ass father. However, this twisted blue waffle becomes a sadistic asshole who puts her daughter through shit that no child should ever have to go through. Which, because of the long line of abuse and mental illness that went untreated in Sparky's lineage, it was only a matter of time before someone in that bloodline woke up one day and said, yep, today's the day I'm gonna go out and get some head. Headhunter by Michael Slade took me by surprise because I didn't consider this book would show in such fine detail how its serial killer was created. So that was pretty cool. Which, on that same note, there were quite a few times where I was wondering where in the hell the author was going with his subplots that not only dated back to a couple of decades prior, but to almost a century prior. And even though I'm not a patient person, I'm glad I was patient with this book because once everything fell into place, I found this to be a very enjoyable read. Aside from that, this book had some really solid character development, and I found myself becoming quickly invested in everyone's well-being. Now, as far as themes are concerned, I noticed where this book focused on women in the workplace, racial profiling, cults, generational trauma, and generational mental illness. Character-wise, as I said, everyone in this book was very well developed, and I quickly became invested in them. However, if you have a hard time keeping up with names, you might need to keep a notebook nearby because there are quite a few characters in this novel. Which, under the circumstances of a whodunit, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it provided me with an extensive suspect list, and it kept me guessing until the very end. As you can imagine, this book had a lot of red herrings, some of which I really enjoyed, and others I wanted to strangle. But because of how everyone was constructed, I really spent the majority of my time second guessing myself in regards to who the guilty party or parties were. Also, I was really impressed with the extensive backstory that we received in regards to the characters from the past. And at first, I really felt like their information was insignificant because I didn't know how they connected with what was going on in the present. But when the grand reveal came, it blew my mind. And after I finished this read, I sat back and just really took everything in. And I felt like not only had I received a lifetime of information about Sparky, but I had received a lifetime of information about Sparky's lineage, which I don't believe I've ever really experienced that to this level with a book before. Theme-wise, I noticed where this book commented on how women aren't as respected as their male counterparts in the workplace. Which, since this book was written in the 1980s, a time when females were accepting more career paths that were deemed masculine, I feel like the author did a good job giving us a glimpse into how toxic men reacted to this change. And while this subject is visited here and there throughout the book, there's one instance where a male constable expects an intimate relationship with his female partner, but after she shoots him down, he reacts with hostility, which I'm sure this type of altercation was pretty common back then, as I'm sure it's still common today. I just hope that the consequences against the aggressor are a little bit more serious now than they were back then. Also, I really do feel like this book comments on how women are underestimated as they're perceived to be the weaker of the genders, which I wish I could elaborate a little bit more on this subject, but if I did, I would reveal some spoilers, so moving on. Another subject that comes into play is racial profiling, which unfortunately this still happens today. But under this circumstance, we see where a constable gets tunnel vision because he's too focused on suspects who are minorities. And earlier in the book, he and the rest of the constables had been warned to keep their options open and to look at each case as being connected and separate. But because of him ignoring this advice, he and his partner strayed way too far from the path. Also, as a side note, even though the majority of everyone in this book weren't saints, it was pretty obvious early on that the minority characters weren't serial killers. But at the same time, had it not been for that racial distraction that the constable had, I tend to think that the headhunter could have been caught sooner. So this was something that was totally used to the killer's advantage. Now, even though I just kind of summed that up, there's a lot that I'm really not saying, and if I were to go into more detail, it would totally give away some spoilers. So it's just better that I shut up on the subject and move on. Aside from that, this book briefly touches on cults, which this comes about because the character DeClerc starts to wonder if these killings are being done by more than one person, which, as he's considering this possibility, he starts to ponder about racial cults, such as the Manson family, the KKK, and the zebra killings. Also, because of how one of the victims appears, DeClerc considers the headhunter could be a worshipper of the god known as Back Wallanis, which translates into cannibal at the north end of the world. And Yeah, I think I said that right, but I'm going to include the spelling here, so if you want to research that god a little bit more, you can. But all I can say is I did have a lot of fun researching that god. I just honestly am not certain that I said his name correctly, but yeah, that was fun to research. Other subjects that I noticed regarded generational trauma and generational mental illness. Now, as far as the generational trauma is concerned, Sparky is the product of an abusive cycle that was never broken. For example, Sparky's grandfather abused his daughter. Sparky's mom was abused by her husband, which in turn she ended up killing her husband, but she became abusive to Sparky. So, yeah, this was a fairly toxic bloodline, and it was really no surprise that there would eventually be a time bomb that was born. And this was mostly because no one in that family actually sought out help or received help. Then, adding to all of that negativity, we have where the mental illness that Sparky's grandfather suffered from had been passed down to Sparky. Which, as I noted in my previous video when I reviewed American Psycho, generational mental illness is really unsettling because it feels like it's something that's inevitable. But aside from that, I was really impressed with how this book was constructed in that regards of a family tree because as it started off in 1897 and ended about 100 years later, it brought into perspective that 100 years really isn't that long and how a toxic family can create a serial killer within just a few generations. Overall, Headhunter didn't scare me, creep me out, or gross me out. However, I feel like there was never a dull moment throughout this book, and I found myself trying to read it whenever I had the opportunity. So I feel like it definitely was an intelligent slasher and a great thriller. Headhunter by Michael Slade was an intellectual whodunit that had the perfect amount of gore. And while I've only read the original version of this book, from what I've been able to tell by the online reviews that I've read, it seems like the updated version of this book has more of a fleshed out background for Sparky. Otherwise, it doesn't seem like there's been any major changes or any type of alterations that could make the ending different. However, if you are watching this video and you've read both versions of the book, please let me know if there's any major differences between the original and the new version. But at the end of the day, if you are looking for a book that blends together thrills and horror perfectly for this time of year, then I highly recommend Headhunter because not only does it suck you into the season, but it keeps you guessing from start to finish. Well, now that I'm at the end of this video, I would like to thank these amazing people for contributing to my Patreon account. As you can tell, some of the names listed here are creators, so be sure to check out their work. And if you would like to contribute to my Patreon account as well, I have a link available in the description section of this episode, where for $5 a month, I'll give you a shout out at the end of my videos. And if there is a profession you would like for me to tie to your name, just let me know and I'll include that as well. Also, I do have a $10 tier available where for $10 a month, I'll still give you this shout out, but I do creepy photography on the side. So at the beginning of every month, I'll send you over one of my creepy photos. From there, you can print it off and do whatever you like with it. So if you're able to do this, that's awesome. If not, no sweat. I just hope you return to this channel so we can have a good time together. Also, if you would like to hit me up on social media, links to my Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram are all in the description section of this episode. And if you've not subscribed to this channel, be sure to subscribe and click that notifications bell because I have more book reviews coming in the near future. So until we see each other again, I hope you have a great week and sweet nightmares.